For showing up. It's so great to have an audience and friendly faces as well. And also thank you to the archives and for this group for allowing me to come here. This is a real honor to be here. I can't believe I'm standing on this stage, so thank you for letting me do that. So I am going to talk to you about this book, which came out in September of 2017 through the University of Alabama Press, and was several years in the making. So I don't have notes. I'm just going to wander here, but hopefully I will wander based on my PowerPoint slides, and that will keep me on target. If I start to go over, somebody give me the sign for that. And there's technology, too, which I may or may not be very adept at. So for those of you who do not know, the Alabama Environmental Quality Association is an organization, a community-based organization that was citizen-driven as well, and it existed from 1973 through 1982. How many of you in the audience knew of it when it was in existence? So there a few people did too. Well, apparently so did I, but I just didn't remember that I knew about it. So I became involved with this book when this woman, Martha McInnis, and many of you may know Martha, she was a native of Montgomery who moved off to have a rather illustrious career in academia and in industry, and then came back to Alabama in the 1960s to work for what's now the Alabama Farmers Federation, was then Farm Bureau. But Martha called me one day. I was sitting at my desk in the basement of Funchess Hall in Auburn, and I got a phone call, and there was this just delightful voice on the other end of the line with this fabulous Montgomery accent, and she introduced herself and said that she had found me via another person who you all might recognize, Dot Moore. Now, the Dot Moore connection for me is that back in the late 1990s, I helped Dot with her book about Mahalia Lancaster, and a psychic from Georgia. So many of you may already be familiar with that book, and certainly with Dot. And so Martha knew that I had helped Dot, and she was trying to find somebody to help write the story of the Alabama Environmental Quality Association, because she felt like it was a piece of Alabama history that had not yet been captured and that a lot of people didn't know about. And at the time, I was working full-time, and I was like, I'd love to help you, but I'm just not sure I'm the person. And then within a year or so of that, I decided that I was going to retire from the university. I had my 25 years in, and what I wanted to do was write full-time. So I called Martha back and said, let's do this book. So we started working on it. Martha provided me, and I'll show you slides of this in a little while, her organization had the most remarkable organizational skills, and they had scrapbooks that literally were waist high, a stack of them, and they were the large format kind. And so I went to her house and sat down with her, and she started telling me stories, and then she loaded in the back of my car this amazing collection of scrapbooks. So I then sat for several months with those scrapbooks open on the floor of our extra bedroom, just leafing through them, full of all kinds of resources. I'm hopeful that at some point they will leave my house and come here. It's no pressure. I'm publicly asking here, but they were just amazing. But at any rate, so I started to piece together the story, and what I began to realize is that as a child in the as a teenager in the mid-1970s, I actually did know not necessarily about this organization, but about a lot of their programs, because between different groups that I was in high school and the people that we knew in Auburn, where I grew up, a lot of the activities that were going on were related or started by the AEQA. So what I love about being a writer is that you get to learn new things, and then sometimes you get to find out things that you knew but you didn't know you knew. So this has been just a great experience for me to be able to learn about the organization and also realize that I actually had connections to it in different ways. So one of the things about the AEQA is that they worked through the years of their existence on a lot of issues, these really important issues, strip mining, oil drilling, climate change, this whole list of things that were very important at the time. And good news, bad news is that they address them, but they're still important, which is the bad news, I think, that a lot of these things that we might have made progress on, maybe not so much. But they were really, really interested in trying to find a way to make Alabama beautiful and to retain the beauty that it already had. So they focused initially on this idea of roadside dumps. And the way that came about was that there was a rural mail carrier who was down in Dale County. His name was Lance Tompkins. And Lance, on his daily rounds, would see all of these roadside dumps and found that very disturbing. And, was trying to figure out how in the world do we get that cleaned up. Well, Lance happened to be also a member of the Farm Bureau in his county, and was very active in it. So Farm Bureau every year, I think still does this, but at the time they would come up with a set of policies that they would approve every year, and then they would address those policies as the year went on. And so Lance came to him and said, I think we need a policy about cleaning up Alabama, the rural areas of Alabama. And they agreed and wrote a policy statement, which is in the book, short and sweet, just about putting some effort into cleaning up the roadsides in Alabama. And then they realized after they had the policy that they probably needed to do something to push that policy forward. Well, about that time, there had been an organization that had been established within Farm Bureau called the Women's Committee. And that was made up primarily of the women who were married to the Farm Bureau board members and who were active there. And these women were, all across the state. Every county had them, and they were really amazing women, but they probably were not fully appreciated till all of this started to happen. So they established this women's committee in Farm Bureau, and they often spent a lot of time looking at, how did they promote cotton and pork with recipe contests and sewing contests. Certainly they did a lot of community action things, but most of it tended to be commodity driven, really, and about trying to promote agriculture. So about that time, Martha comes back to Alabama and is hired by Farm Bureau to be the director of the Women's Committee. And so they hand off the idea of a rural cleanup program to these women and to Martha, and those women took it and they ran with it. Now, whether or not anybody in the hierarchy in Farm Bureau realized that was going to happen, who knows? I doubt Lance Tompkins realized what he was starting when he actually began to lobby for something to happen. But the women in those counties and on that state committee took this project and then just went to town with it and started lobbying for cleanup and litter control and things like that. So these sorts of sites were obviously on their radar screen. Not only were these, of course, ugly, but they were also dangerous. They were places for mosquitoes and for other creatures that we don't want to encounter, snakes and rats and things like that. Also, potentially, children, somebody could get hurt in them. So there's a health reason to clean them up, not just a aesthetic reason. But one problem was that people didn't necessarily have a way to get rid of refuse at the time. There was not a waste management system in place, so they would just dump it. But they needed to figure out a way to clean it up. So they got started on it. Just a few more pictures of the kinds of things that you'd find out there, including, of course, chemicals that could then go into the groundwater, old cars. We all have seen these. And people, of course, on their own were already making some effort to be able to try to clean up things in their own neighborhoods, in their own streams. So it wasn't as though this was a new concept of getting out there and trying to clean up your neighborhood, but there just hadn't been any group that was pulling everybody together in order to do that. So these are some of the women, and some of you may recognize even some of these women, who were the initial members of the Women's Committee and who took this idea and ran with it. And these women in their own right were just really just remarkable. According to Martha, a lot of them found themselves in this organization because they had probably not been activists by any means, and certainly may not have. One of the women, Dot Smith, didn't even have a driver's license when they first started this, and went on not only to become a licensed driver, but also was elected to the Tuscaloosa Area Board of Education, took trips all over the United States, so her world sort of opened up, partly because of her activities with this organization. But early on, the National Chamber of Commerce recognized just what a remarkable job these women had been doing in their communities. And some of that sprang from things like they were getting out there and doing it. These are women at the site of the old Cahaba who were out there cleaning up in their nice coats and hats and things like that, but they were getting out there and they were not only promoting it, they were actually getting out there and doing it. This is just one example of the thousands of pictures, maybe not thousands, lots of pictures that are in these scrapbooks. Another shot of them at Old Cahaba. Then they also would do these campaigns where they would arrest, like, the local sheriff and make him sign a pledge to be able to help with the cleanup in their area. Lots of little marketing ploys and lots of ways that they would engage people in this. But because they were part of their local community and because they were important people in their community as well, they knew how to leverage what their local contacts were. And so they would get everybody in their county, their commissioners, their city council people, their other politicians and shakers and movers in their community to sign up and start working on this idea of a rural cleanup. This is from Auburn, Opelika area. So, this is tight. Each little community often came up with their own ideas of how they were going to promote it in their community. And this is when I saw that picture, I was like, I remember the Tidy Tiger when, growing up. So these were all things that's when things started coming back to me at that point. So they started this campaign about going out and let's do a rural cleanup. They did lots of different kinds of promotions in order to do that. And then they actually got the support of a very important person, and that was Lurleen Wallace. So I know I've got a slide. I'll get to that in a minute. But Martha, who was pretty adept at how do you leverage your allies, and so she started figuring out ways and had the backing of Farm Bureau behind her to do this, to engage the statewide politicians in this. And one of the first people they went to was Lurleen, who was governor at the time, and who was interested in this not only because I think she was interested in cleaning up Alabama, but because it was a girl thing. She really wanted to support these women in what they were doing. So she was the first one to actually sign a proclamation saying that they were going to have a rural cleanup day throughout Alabama. And so the whole state, every county, and I think actually participated in that. After Lurleen's death, and then when Albert Brewer became governor, he carried that on. And so this proclamation is the one that he signed the following year, I believe, in order to keep that effort going. And sure enough, people got out there and they cleaned their neighborhoods, they cleaned their roadsides, they just did an amazing job on that particular day. And within a few weeks, there it was again. There was, litter again all over the place. So they began to realize that it took more than one day and that it took some sort of concerted effort in order to be able to make this happen. At this time, all of this was still occurring under the auspices of the Alabama Farm Bureau organization. So they began to realize that they really needed to have a separate organization in order to do this. So Martha set to work finding funding for that. And eventually, you'll have to read the book to get the details of that, but eventually was able to secure a grant from a federal grant in order to be able to fund an organization that would be an environmental education association. So that was what they focused on, and that's when the AEQA was actually founded. She joined forces with a gentleman named John Bloomer, who was the editor of the Birmingham Post-Herald, I believe, but it may have been the News. I can't remember at the time. But she and John Bloomer formed a partnership because she actually showed up on his doorstep one day and said, we've got this rural cleanup effort underway. We feel like it needs to be furthered. What can you do to help us? And he said to Martha, if you will provide me for a week ahead of time before the actual rural cleanup day, a story about the successes or the needs for every issue of the newspaper, then I will run it. And she did that, and they ran it, and then after that, they were partners in crime for the rest of the existence of the AEQA. One of the things, of course, not necessarily politically correct, but it was the fact that these women were actually out there cleaning up and certainly did an amazing job of sweeping up all of the debris, as both the physical debris and also trying to sweep into action all of these people. So I think that would be a really good one for y'all to have. Yes, Lenore Vickery is here from the Rural Electric Association. So Lurleen was their first real advocate for this, and she really did, support it remarkably well. And then after that, Albert Brewer came in and stuck with it. We actually were able to interview Governor Brewer for the book before he passed away. So which was an amazing experience to be able to talk to him and hear him reminisce about that particular period of history in general in Alabama, but also environmental history at that particular time. From there, Governor Wallace, George, got back into power, and to his credit, he continued to support this. And in fact, he and Martha and the AEQA had a really tight relationship. And he actually helped her find funding through the state in order to continue the work of the AEQA, which was a controversial thing, which I'll touch on in a minute. But through his help, they were actually able to accomplish a good number of things. I have to admit, I was a little surprised to learn about that myself, but he was a huge supporter throughout his many tenures in office. And then Bob James also continued to support the idea of a rural cleanup week and all the efforts that they were doing. Ended up not being such a supporter of them as far as funding goes, and so as things closed down for the organization, he was more of an adversary more than a patron of the organization. Although there's a line in the book where they've been trying to cut funding for the AEQA in the legislature, and Martha fought tooth and toenail to keep it in, and that next day after she managed to keep it in that particular budget, he said, "I've heard about Martha McInnis, and now I know who she is," because she was fierce in her protection of that particular organization and its funding. So one of the things that the AEQA did, they started out, of course, working on the idea of litter. And a lot of people said that's just that litter organization. And sure enough, that was a big focus of what they did, but they got involved in a lot of other things. One thing they did was they tried to increase the visibility of the importance of the environment by bringing in a lot of national speakers. And they would have a banquet every year where they would award communities for the work that they'd been doing, and then they would have keynote speakers like this is Jules Vergen from back in the day. And they brought in a whole variety of people. I always mispronounce his name, Shruptrine, the artist who did Jericho, The South Beheld, came in and displayed his artwork. And they would have these events and have these speakers come in so that they drew crowds outside of their normal group. So they were really good at that sort of promotional kind of thing. But in addition to that, they also got involved with a lot of other projects. So how many of you are familiar with the Bartram Trail Conference? Okay. So the beginnings of that conference actually started in the AEQA. Martha, about the time that the National Trails Act was coming along, Martha and her group recognized that Alabama, of course, had lots of areas that would be included in a national trail, and that it would be huge for tourism and for outdoor sports, and they're just a great opportunity. But every state, all of the 8 states that had been involved, that Bartram went through, had been doing similar things, and they hadn't made much progress. Each little state would try and push something along, and it didn't get anywhere. So Martha decided, well, maybe what you need to do is to actually all 8 states come together. So she convinced, and I think may have written the letter, George Wallace to send to all of the other governors of the other 7 states and bring a group together in Montgomery to start talking about how do they combine forces. And from that sprang what is now known as the Barton Trail Conference. Ultimately, they were not successful in actually getting a national trail designated yet. That could still happen. There's hope. But the Bartram Trail Conference itself is roots are all based in what the AEQA started along those lines. This is just a sign. This is when Tuskegee's section of the Bartram Trail was actually committed. And so that's Martha on the right, with John Bloomer here on the left. So in the meantime, they also put together a book called The Trails of Alabama. The idea, of course, was to list both private and public trails that could be hiked in the state, where they were located. It's sort of one of those trail guides where how hard is this trail and do you want to tackle it kind of thing. But Nancy Callahan, does anybody know Nancy? was the one who actually put all of that together. She was their communications director at the time. So anyway, Trails of Alabama was published. This was one of many publications that the AEQA put together and put out there. They also got really involved in recycling. So this was when recycling had, a little bit of legs going, but they weren't really sure. People hadn't figured out how to use it, and certainly hadn't become a common thing for everybody to do. But again, Martha and her group saw that there was an opportunity here for recycling, not only to help with cleanup, but also to have financial advantages for those who were doing it. So they started rallying the troops, so to speak, to start with trying to figure out ways to fund recycling opportunities in the state and actually throughout the Southeast. There is still Southeast Recycling Conference that's held usually, I think, in Georgia, maybe in various areas. That was a huge shaker and mover in that, and that again was something that started within the AEQA under their umbrella. They managed to get people from all walks of life to be involved in this. This is a group from the Beloit community. Are you all familiar with that area in West Alabama? They had been already recycling. They already got that they needed to be reusing things, and so they had all of these systems done that they were putting together glass and newspaper and various things. And so they got involved with it and ended up becoming, award winners for the work that they were doing. One of the gentlemen in this picture actually had developed a glass crusher that was portable, and he hauled it up to Montgomery for a conference, and all of these guys from like the major glass recycling organizations were here, and he showed them how it worked. I like to believe that the technology we see today came from that particular gentleman. But they figured out that there's a lot, the newspapers, so many things that could be recycled, and that people could actually benefit financially from doing so. They came up with a whole lot of publications teaching people how to do that, both at home and in communities. From there, they also, and the list of things that they got involved in is much longer than I'm going to give y'all in these few minutes today. But toward the end of their existence, they came up with the idea of establishing something called pride communities. And so the idea was that they would set a list of standards that each community would actually, once they met those, then they would get a sign, sort of like a Tree City sorts of signs that you see now. And so they had gotten that started at that particular time, right before that they actually lost their funding. And it was starting to kind of gain some momentum, and they felt like that was another way to get communities involved. The AEQA and a lot of these organizations in each county had won all of these Keep America Beautiful awards through the years. They had won so many awards that they were no longer allowed in the competition. But they had gotten national awards for the work that they were doing in communities. And a lot of that beautification organizations that still exist today who were involved in it back then. So they started this idea of the pride communities. And then about that time, though, we're facing the real funding issues. So this is when the legislature was saying, why are you getting money from the state when you're not really a state organization? And there were other organizations in the state, particularly environmental organizations, who felt like the AEQA was not as that they were getting money that could be spent better elsewhere, and that they were in competition to some degree with some other organizations, and also that they were way too tight with organizations like Farm Bureau and also with Governor Wallace and the politicians. So there was a lot of pushback from other environmentalists in the state as well, understandably so. There's just, there were things that they felt like they were too cozy is really a lot of what the problem was. And sometimes the AEQA ended up on the side of things that was not the same side that the other environmental organizations were on as well. So, but at that particular time, there was, just a lot of pushback and a lot of controversy, a lot of activism going on. And the AEQA was not necessarily, in fact, they were not activists. They considered themselves educators, and that their goal was to educate and to advocate, but not necessarily to be activists in the true sense. So between pushback from other environmental groups, pushback from state funding agencies, and for various other reasons, then they were on the chopping block. And in 1983, their funding was actually pulled from the state legislature, which left them unprepared. They didn't have other sources of funding to fall back on. So they closed down the AEQA. During the years that the AEQA existed, though, they had also started something called Enviro South. And Enviro South the idea behind that was that there was what had been happening in Alabama could be happening region-wide. So they started this organization, but also started a magazine. And I don't know if any of y'all remember getting Enviro South magazine. It was a pretty remarkable magazine. They had some amazing people who wrote for the magazine. The governors of every state would put articles in there. They had really well-known authors who were in there, and Jimmy Carter wrote for it. So there were a lot of different voices in those magazines. Martha was continued on after the AEQA was shut down to run Enviro South for a number of years afterwards, and continued to do the work that they were doing. But basically, the AEQA was no longer in existence. So here's an example of the scrapbooks that have been on my bed, which I think those of you who are truly archivists are probably cringing at the fact that these are not better protected than spread open on my bed. But those are some of the ones I had. The other thing that Martha had was this treasure trove of different art and things that were used throughout the time of the AEQA. So all of these things are available. And, we just barely put a dent in the kinds of information that they provided for us. As far as I could have spent another year just going through all those publications, and certainly we'd have had a bigger book for sure. But ultimately, this is what came from that. So the University of Alabama Press was gracious enough to publish this book. And the idea was that we felt like it was time for the story to be told to the rest of the state. Certainly, most of the people who'd been involved with it had either gone on to other things or had just, people had forgotten about it. And while it has not necessarily... It's certainly not the only environmental organization in the state that's made remarkable strides and done some remarkable things. I felt like it was really important for that story to be told, and also that story of the women who are behind it, including Martha. It's just a great opportunity to tell the story of what these women did, and maybe not even intentionally setting out to do to make some differences in our lives. Martha considers this a grassroots organization. She always considered it one where they went out and got feedback from communities in order to figure out what needed to happen. So every community would often have a different need. And so they tried to work together with their committees across the state to be able to find ways to meet the needs in each of those communities. So I think that's all I really had as far as slides. If it's not too soon, I'll be glad to open it up for questions. Okay. See if he can reach you. Yeah, here. Right. Or she can reach you, yes.
Thanks. So I actually have two questions.
Okay.
One is, at its peak, can you just say whether there was full-time staff? Did they have an office? Mm-hmm. Or what did the sort of organizational structure look like when it was at its largest? And then the second question is, I work for the Sierra Club, and we're thinking through some hard questions at the Sierra Club about the whiteness of the environmental movement. And thinking about Alabama politics in the 60s and even early 70s, there was a lot of civil rights activism going on. And I was wondering in your research if you came across anything about the relationship of this organization to sort of the civil rights or social justice type organizations that were also operating in the same environment.
Right. Yeah, so the first answer to your first question is they had a staff of up to 4 or 5 people at their height, including a field representative who would go out to each of the counties and find out their needs and work with them, a communications person, office help as well, and then Martha. And Martha was the executive director of it throughout its existence. So typically between 4 and 5 people who are full-time, then a lot of other people who would come in and help on part-time basis. They also would bring in people for specific things. For instance, they did a feasibility study for the Bartram Trail, and so they brought in Robert Peck, who is a very, very well-known historian from up in Pennsylvania, who did that. So they had sort of a revolving staff for that, but a pretty amazing small group, but really dedicated to what they were doing. And to answer your second question, I don't know that they actually had any close ties. It certainly didn't come up in any of my research to that side of the civil rights thing. I think that they were so focused on what they were doing that was not even part of what they were looking at. However, I do think that they did a rather remarkable job of trying to include every group who was interested in the environment. And so, in that day and time, one of the great things about interviewing Governor Brewer was that he talked about all the strife that was going on at that particular time and how it was such a tough time, but in many ways a really progressive time in Alabama. And what a pity that we haven't necessarily kept all the progressive ideas going through the years. But he talked about he would have to fly into Birmingham and that they could not land except on instruments because the smog was so bad, and that how important it was that all of these environmental restrictions went into place, because he said the health and well-being of so many communities and how it was tough. He was caught there in the middle of the politics of that, but he said, looking back on it, how could we not do that? So a lot of people thinking along those lines about what this means to our communities of all people. Does that answer your question? Any other questions?
Do you know if there was any public outcry when the SEQA went out of existence?
I don't think that there was. I imagine the groups themselves, the local people who were involved, were heartbroken. And the clippings that I've got mostly came from just basic news stories about what happened and how that went down. I think by that time that there were enough funding problems in the state, certainly proration, things like that people were like, well, how do we justify this? Martha always has said to me that the way that she felt like it was justified for them to get the funding that they'd gotten from the state was at that particular time, no such other organizations in the state existed that were looking at the environment. So the government itself did not have an entity that was really focused on that. Now they do. But at the time, they were filling a gap that she felt like. But no, I don't know that there was a huge outcry, except a lot of sadness from those who had been involved with it. Any other questions?
I don't really have a question. I just have a comment, and I just want to say thank you for sharing this part of history that I was not familiar with. I'm the director of the Alabama Rivers Alliance, so probably standing on the shoulders of some of these people and the work that we do to protect clean water. And I've heard some of the history of environmental activism more so in the state than this piece. And so I think it's really, it's exciting to know even more about where we all came from and this movement came from. And I guess if I had a question, I would say, are some of these people still around? Would they be willing to talk to us sometime?
Yeah.
And, I'm going to get the book, of course, and read the details.
Good.
But I think it's important. There are a lot of environmental groups now, obviously, and I think there's still a history or still some truth to the division between the groups that get government funding and the groups that are doing more activist work that are privately funded. But it's always good to continue to learn those dynamics and how we can all work together, because we're really all in it for the same reason. So I would love to meet her.
Yeah. Well, in fact, she would hope to be here today, and she's had some health issues, so she lives in Huntsville now. If she were here in Montgomery, we'd have gotten her here, but it was just too hard for her to travel down. But I'm sure she would love to talk to you about that. And there are a few other people around who were also involved in it, including Nancy, who's in Tuscaloosa. And then I think a lot of other people who have been involved. Carolyn Hutchison from Troy Public Radio was actually really involved with work on the Bartram Trail and also on the Cahaba River, and worked with the AEQA for that. So a lot of institutional knowledge is still out there, and I think you're so right. The opportunity to capture what they did right and what they did wrong, because that, potentially if they had thought ahead, and Martha even says this, if we'd really been thinking about how sustainable are we and how do we become more sustainable, then they might have lasted longer and maybe even still be here today. But that idea of working cooperatively is just you know, in this day and age, the idea of cooperating with each other is really important, I think. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for being here. And I think there are books, so.
Thanks, everybody. We do have a couple of books left out in the lobby, so if you want to get one of those and have Katie sign it, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much.